This is the new MG4 and lots of people have been raving about this car because it's so much cheaper than every other electric car out there. But is it actually any good, or are people being blinded by the price tag? Well, to find out, we're putting it up against the current benchmark for small electric cars, which is the Cupra Born. In this review, we're comparing both of these cars in every area. But before we start, make sure you're subscribed to our channel to see lots more reviews like this, and go to whatcar.com for a great deal on your next car. So the Cupra Born was the first fully electric car from Spanish manufacturer Cupra. Now this car is based very closely on the ID3, and basically it takes all the good bits of that fantastic electric car, gives it a better interior, better infotainment system, so ultimately this Born is better than the ID3. And since this first went on sale in 2021, it's been our favourite small electric car. But is it still the best? This is the MG4, and it's an all-new, fully electric rival which follows a string of other impressive EVs from MG, like the MG5 and the MG ZS EV. Now, this is a similar size to the Born, and both those cars are available with two different battery sizes, but while some things are similar, there is one huge difference. We'll come to that later. First, let's compare these interiors, starting with the Born, and it's pretty nice in here. There's a lot of high quality feeling materials, not everywhere, but in the important places, and overall, it helps it feel pretty premium inside. But this interior isn't without its annoyances, mainly with regards to the technology in here. So these steering wheel controls are pretty useless. They're touch sensitive, and they're very, very easy to accidentally trigger and quite difficult to use deliberately as well. So they're not very good. And this touchscreen infotainment system, well, it's a nice big screen, which is good. It's angled slightly towards the driver. Again, pretty good because it's easy to reach from the driver's seat. But it's got a really unintuitive layout. It's very confusing. It's a bit laggy. The response time isn't great. And perhaps the worst thing of all is the fact that adjusting the climate has to be done through this infotainment system. And you've got these rubbish sliders down here, which are very difficult to use, and they're not backlit, so you can't actually see them at all when it's dark in here. The MG4's infotainment system also isn't particularly good, and not only are the climate controls on the touchscreen itself, but also if you want to change simple things like the level of regenerative braking or the driving mode, that has to be done through this screen as well. And look at how small the text is, so it's actually quite difficult to see what's going on the screen here and read those tiny menus. So both systems definitely have their drawbacks. At least with the MG4, you've got some physical buttons here, and both systems get Apple CarPlay and Android Auto as well. Although, with the Born, it's wireless, in the MG4, it's wired. On quite a few different MG4s we've tried, the connection's been fairly temperamental, to say the least. There is a much clearer difference when it comes to interior quality though, because the MG4 does feel like a step down compared to the Cupra Born, to be honest. So you might like the look and the layout of things in here, but closer inspection shows you that a lot of these materials don't feel particularly nice and are actually fairly cheap feeling as well. The build quality is also not amazing. So the Born definitely is better in terms of interior quality than the MG4. The two cars are close when it comes to rear seat space, and ultimately in the small electric car class, both of these cars are practical options when it comes to rear seat space. So you can see in the back of the Born, I've got loads of legroom, headroom is also pretty good. So even if you're 6 foot sat in the back, you should still be comfortable here. In terms of differences between the two cars, the Born just has slightly more supportive rear seats. And also the floor in the MG4 is higher, so you're sat at a slightly more awkward angle for your knees compared to the Born. The Born is also better for 3 people side by side in the back, partly because there's no head restraint for the middle passenger, which seems like a bit of a safety oversight. Although, despite that, both this and the Born got the full 5-star safety rating from crash safety experts Euro NCAP. So rear seat space is quite close between these two cars, but there's more of a difference when it comes to the boots, because the Born is bigger. In total, you'll be able to fit 6 carry-on size suitcases into the boot of the Born below the parcel shelf, compared to 5 in the back of the MG4. The Born does have a slightly bigger loading lip, but ultimately it's the bigger, more practical choice. You can get a height adjustable boot floor on both these cars, but to do that in the MG4, you need to go for range topping trophy trim. In the Born, it's an optional extra no matter what trim that you go for. Disappointingly, there's no front boot in either of these cars.
Could one of these EVs be your only household car? Well, they might be big enough, but it's also important to consider how far they can travel on a full charge.
And that depends on which versions of these cars that you go for. With the Born, there's a 58 kilowatt hour battery or a 77 kilowatt hour battery. In the MG4, you can have a 51 kilowatt hour battery or a 64 kilowatt hour battery. So yes, ultimately the Born has bigger batteries. It can travel further on a full charge than the MG4, and it's quite a useful amount of miles extra than this car as well. But just bear in mind that like every other electric car around, the official WLTP figures won't be achievable in regular everyday driving. So when you're driving these cars around normally, especially in cold weather like this, the miles they cover will be a lot less than the quoted figures.
The range you'll actually get from a full charge will be about 10 to 15% less than the WLTP numbers. You can click on the link to watch our real range test to see exactly how far electric cars can travel on a full charge in real-world driving conditions. When you do need to charge up the Born and the MG4, the maximum charging rate available for both cars depends on the version you go for, but the difference isn't huge. And while the maximum charging rate is less in the Born, it's actually predicted to have a faster average charging speed. All of which means when it comes to rapid charging, they take roughly the same amount of time. So a charge as quickly as the MG4 can manage will get you a 10 to 80% top up in around about 35 to 40 minutes. And the Born will likely be done a minute or two earlier. The times are pretty similar from a 50 kilowatt charger as well, ranging from 51 minutes up to 71 minutes. With a 7 kilowatt home wall box, you're looking at empty to full in around 10 to 12 hours.
So which one of these is better on the road? Well, starting with the Cupra Born, this is a pretty tough car to beat because in the small electric car class, there just isn't anything that's better than this on the road, basically. The reasons for that are that primarily it's comfortable, it has tidy and precise handling as well, it's really quiet on the motorway, so not only is it good to drive, but it's also a quiet and relaxing electric car to be in as well. So how does the MG4 compare on the road? Well, to be honest, it's like all other areas of comparison between these two cars in that the MG4 is strong in certain areas, but it's not quite as good as the Cupra Born. So for example, this is a fairly comfortable electric car, and what it does nicely is take the sting out of potholes or speed bumps that you might pass over, but it also has a kind of subtle bouncing sensation to the ride as well, and that's especially noticeable at higher speeds. Ultimately, that means that the Born feels more settled, more relaxing. It's the more comfortable car. The Born's also better to drive, it's more accurate, steering's got nicer weighting to it. The brake pedal feel is also more consistent in the Born. And maybe the biggest weakness in this MG4 is the wind noise, because on the motorway, this is really quite noisy inside, especially by electric car standards. But overall, this is still a good electric car on the road. It's just not quite as good as the Cupra Born. But here is the big difference. The cheapest version of the Born that you can buy is just over £36,000, but you can spend more than £43,000 on one. The cheapest version of the MG4 is £25,995. Now granted, that is still a lot of money, but in terms of new electric cars, that is incredibly good value. Even the most expensive version of this is £31,495, which is still loads cheaper than even the entry-level version of the Born. And on top of all that, the MG4 gets a brilliant 7-year or 90,000 mile warranty, whereas the Born gets a pretty poor 3-year, 60,000 mile warranty.
If you want to buy a Born, we reckon the pick of the lineup is actually the 58 kilowatt hour battery option. But of course, if you will be regularly doing long journeys, then you might want to consider the 77 kilowatt hour version because of its greater range. We'd stick with entry-level V1 trim because it's the cheapest but still well equipped. You might want to consider diving into the options list to add a heat pump to help improve the range in winter. If you want an MG4, just like the Born, we think the smaller of the two batteries is actually the pick of the lineup because it is so much cheaper than any other rival and still has a decent range for the money. But again, if you regularly do big journeys, the bigger battery is still excellent value. SE trim is very well equipped and it's the one we'd go for. You get things like adaptive cruise control, rear parking sensors and vehicle to load charging, which basically turns the car into a massive portable 3-pin plug. Range topping trophy gets heated front seats, a heated steering wheel, a 360-degree camera, but it starts to push the price up, so SE makes the MG look more tempting. But which EV is best overall? Well, as we've explained, the Born is the better car. It's more refined on the road, nicer inside, a little more practical. Those differences aren't huge though.
But depending on the spec that you go for, the MG4 can be as much as £10,000 cheaper than a Cupra Born. And okay, it's not quite as good in a few areas, but it's still a very good electric car, and it is significantly cheaper.
So that is why the MG4 is the best small electric car that you can buy.
For more information on both these cars, go to whatcar.com, where you can also get a great deal on your next car. But before you go, if you want to see lots more reviews like this, make sure you subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments below, which one would you go for? Would you spend more money to get a slightly better car, or would you save some cash and go for the MG4?